Singularity.
My name is Nicola, aka Socrates, and you're watching Singularity One-on-One. If you enjoy this show, you can help me make it better by writing a review on iTunes or simply by making a donation. As always, I will be the man with the questions, and today my guest is Professor Richard Jones. Dr. Jones is Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research and Innovation and Professor of Physics at the University of Sheffield. But most importantly, Richard is the author of a provocative recent book titled Against Transhumanism, The Delusion of Technological Transcendence. So, hi, and thanks for joining us today, Richard.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Hi.
Fantastic. Excellent. So, Richard, can you perhaps introduce yourself in a couple of words?
Yeah, so I'm an experimental physicist and I work on macromolecules. And I became interested in the idea of nanotechnology because, it's part of what I'm trying to do in my lab work, really, is to try and imitate some of the ways that cell biology works. So thinking about nanotechnology kind of made me confront the thinking about the kind of nanotechnology that Drexler is associated with, and really made me think a little bit about the kinds of technical claims that underlie transhumanism. And then thinking about those technical claims, that kind of took me on to think a little bit more about the entire the package, if you like, including some of the perhaps non-technical penumbra. So I'm a physicist, and I've kind of come to think about this this interesting phenomenon of transhumanism through thinking first about the technical issues, but then thinking about some of the broader issues too.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic, and which is, of course, the reason why we're talking today. I have to say I enjoyed reading your book tremendously, and I might go even as far as saying that I agree with 60 or 70% of it. So let's see how our conversation would go today.
Absolutely.
So first of all, let's try and perhaps keep it at the macro level for a second here, and about the sort of the broader issues, and tell us, what was your motivation? What was your sort of moment or goal when you decided to write this book against transhumanism? Because it took considerable time and effort and focus to do that, of course.
Well, I mean, it's the result of quite a long time, and it in a sense, it brings together some writing that I've already been doing. I've been writing a blog about nanotechnology and transhumanism and other issues since actually 2004, I believe I started it. I wrote a book about nanotechnology in 2004, so that's when I started thinking about it. But I think what the motivation really was thinking a lot about technology and technological innovation and technological progress. And in a sense, that's where my day job, if you like, is to think about science, research, technology in a research university. A lot of thinking about the economic situation that we're in, that progress doesn't seem to be going as fast as we thought. So it's a bit of I came at it from thinking about this idea of progress, this idea of technological progress. And I suppose the transhumanist notion that technological progress is to some extent something, a force that has its own momentum and is continually accelerating. And I suppose the immediate, our immediate economic circumstances, that's the paradox. Transhumanists talk about accelerating technological change. In terms of our economy, we're actually not seeing stuff accelerating. We've got this bit of a sense maybe things are stagnating a little bit. So thinking about what technological progress is, what you have to do to make it progress, what it means to talk about progress, those are the issues that made me put this thing together at this point in time.
So it seems your imagination or interest was captivated by the sort of the seeming paradox between the claim of accelerating change and exponential growth on the one hand, and the fact that we fail to observe that to translate into the economy or other major parts of our lifestyle. Is that fair to say?
That's fair. Yeah, that's right. And, and the sense actually, there's technological progress that we'd like to see that's not happening. And, there are things that I wish were going faster. It's not, It's not a question of just observing this. I mean, I think that there are urgent issues that we need that technological progress for. So the fact that it doesn't appear to be happening is actually a serious problem for us.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I will come back to discuss that a little bit later, but to me, one of the parts that I kind of disagree with you, and I want to touch on briefly, is the point of technological determinism, broadly speaking, right? So, you see, I've done about maybe 190 interviews on or around the topic of the singularity and transhumanism, or at least related to it, with a number of your colleagues, by the way, physicists, who are, I would say, overly represented in the field on both sides of the conversation. And I have some funny quotes for you that I bet you would enjoy tremendously later on. But one thing that I would like to say is that besides the major point that transhumanism is a very wide umbrella, and on the one hand, you can find extreme libertarians and also you can find socialists. So we cover the whole political and social spectrum. But I would say that in my view, the sort of the technological determinism streak as part of that movement is very minor, in my opinion, in my experience. It's there, definitely. There are some people who are exhibiting that, but I would say on the whole, they were a very tiny minority in my experience. So what do you want to say about that? Because I am not a technological determinist personally, and I would say most of the transhumanists are not either.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment, and you're not the first person to say that. And over the years, I've engaged in conversations with transhumanists of various types, and I appreciate that. It's a very broad church in the sense there are many different opinions. However, I guess what I'm interested in is not, I'm interested in transhumanism in the sense of what the many interesting people who subscribe to it in different ways think, but in a sense how it gets translated into wider culture and how it kind of affects our broader way of talking about technology. So in a sense, maybe the problem isn't what transhumanists like you do or don't believe, it's what views about technology emerge into broader society as a result of transhumanist influences. And of course, that's weighted by those people who've got the biggest kind of media profile. So, Ray Kurzweil, obviously, in terms of writing, is the most perhaps the most visible transhumanist, and so I think there are very strong characteristics of technological determinism in his writing. I think in terms of the kind of political clout, it's the various Silicon Valley magnates, as it were, who I think do convey that, and I think underlying it all, that it's connected to people's perception of technology as it comes through, in particular ICT. And of course, you can't talk about computers and ICT without talking about Moore's law. And as soon as you say it's Moore's law, you say it's a law, and a law is something that's deterministic. So it's I kind of accept your point that within over the many people who think about transhumanism, that there are different views. But in terms of how those beliefs feed into broader culture, I think that's a characteristic of it, which I think gets highlighted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also kind of disagree with you whether as to Ray Kurzweil, who is probably as you say the most highly profile or most visible transhumanist out there in media, but I do not think that he is a technological determinist. I had a number of conversations with him. He's and also determinism presupposes, and you actually touch a little bit about that in your book, presupposes kind of a passivity, which is one of the reasons why you criticize it. But of course, Ray Kurzweil is not a mere observer. He's not a passive kind of guy. He is right there. And now he may be wrong about his technological claims. He may be wrong about his vision about the future. He may be wrong about his timeline. but he's definitely not a passive observer. He's an active participant, and with the intention to create what he foresees in the best possible manner. So that's why I don't think that I agree with you on the claim of technological transhumanism, especially per Ray.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think it's I'm not going to argue with you about Kurzweil's record as an actual practicing technologist. It's obviously he has many achievements to his credit, and that's.
Let me give you then a funny occurrence in one of my previous interviews with one of your very notable physics colleagues, where the roles were reversed. So I told him that we have a little bit of a disagreement on the certainty and especially on the inevitability of the singularity.
Yes.
To which his response was, quote, "Well, that's because you don't understand the laws of physics and quantum mechanics, and I do. Because, again, quote, the laws of physics say that the singularity is inevitable," end of quote. And of course, that was Professor Frank J. Tipler.
Yes, well, I would I would disagree with that.
I would disagree with that too.
On both counts, I mean, I disagree on the specifics, but I find it very difficult to see how the laws of quantum mechanics can lead you to any such conclusion. Fascinating, no, they are, and very puzzling. But of all the conclusions they might lead to, I can't really quite think of that one.
But to me, it's interesting that another colleague of yours, who is a well-known mathematician and physicist, kind of came with such a strong claim, because again, I very much doubt technological determinism myself. I'm absolutely not one of it. And every time, and as I said, there's a small minority of people, and Frank J. Tipler is perhaps the best example of that, who think that the singularity is inevitable and so on. And I argue against them, and this is the answer I get back. That's because you don't get physics. And they're probably right, because Frank J. Tipler certainly knows infinitely more about quantum mechanics and physics than I do.
There's something, I mean, this is probably going to take us down a tangent, but there's something very interesting about, physics has a very big streak of Platonism in it. In particular, actually Christian Neoplatonism is where physics came from. And, I talk about some of the strange roots of transhumanism in my ebook. You could talk about some of the strange roots of physics too. And actually, they're a little bit entangled as well. So that kind of sense of some of those kind of things that are less empirical than the kind of physics that perhaps the physics tradition I was brought up in they appear amongst some physicist colleagues.
So there seem to be some interesting similarities between transhumanism and physics then.
No, absolutely. Yeah, well, as I say, it's that when you delve into intellectual history, you go to some strange places.
Absolutely. It's very fascinating. And I really appreciate your kind of time and effort to go through intellectual history, which I think is very revealing and very relevant. And we're going to talk about it in a second. But let's take your argument step by step as kind of it unfolds into your book. So first of all, let's start with page 6, perhaps, where you say, "It's worth making the obvious point that an exponential function doesn't have a singularity."
Yeah.
I think it's worth touching on that. Can you please elaborate?
Well, I suppose, again, maybe this is pointing towards, much of the stuff that Kurzweil writes. The nature of exponential growth, it's interesting, but an exponential mathematically doesn't have a singularity. An exponential represents a constant rate of fractional growth. And actually, it's quite I know people say, oh, we're used to a world of linear, things growing linearly, and exponential growth is very foreign to us. Actually, I don't think that's true. Exponential growth is very natural to us, because exponential growth comes from saying, every year I'm going to do 10% better than I did last year. I think so, and it just keeps on growing.
But the idea is we don't get the cumulative effect of that. So, for example, the best example of that may be perhaps the compound interest, right? People don't quite get the power, supposedly, of compound interest.
No, that's fair enough, but it's not. But then they perhaps don't get the power of compound interest, and this is an important factor for why people don't make enough provision for their retirement. But compound interest is not a fundamentally foreign idea, is it? The point is, compound interest builds your money up, but your money never explodes. It never goes to infinity. It gets very big. We're richer now than we were in 1500, on the basis of 5 centuries of compound interest. And, so that means we're very much richer than we were in 1500. But, we still haven't got to a singularity. Our lives are very different in some ways, but in some ways they're still recognisably human. So exponential growth is an interesting thing. But it's not. It doesn't lead to a singularity. What does lead to a singularity is having exponential growth, where the rate, or where the growth rate is itself accelerating. And that I do. Just for mathematical terms, that's how you get a function that explodes, that goes to infinity. You have e to the minus t over t naught or something, where you've got something that's making the fractional rate increase with time. And there are systems that you see that in physics. There are systems that do have singularities, that's an essential singularity in mathematical terms. But we don't really see the evidence that that's happening in technological growth, or indeed in economic growth. And actually in economic growth, it's definitely not happening, because if anything's happening, the rate is slowing down, not speeding up.
So I have to say I kind of agree with you largely on that, but if I were to play Ray Kurzweil here, the two usual replies to your argument that he would give here in this context would be the fact that exponential growth is deceptive in the beginning. So because we're talking of the doubling of very small quantities, so it's kind of deceptively small and invisible for a very long time. And perhaps he would say right now we are in that part of the curve. And secondly, as per whether it's accelerating, some people would argue, I don't know if Ray would still do that, but some would argue that it is, or at least for some time it was. So, for example, Moore's law used to take 24 to 36 months. Then it supposedly at some point dropped down to about 13 or 14 months at the peak of sort of our capacity to double the number of transistors per $1,000 of computation. And now supposedly once we're reaching against the level of sort of 5 nanometers we have, or 7 to 5 nanometers, we're slowing down again tremendously, and even Intel had to change its projected timeline for the next generation of Intel transistors. So I agree with you, but maybe there was some part of Moore's law where it was indeed kind of a more of an exponential, accelerating exponential, where the time was shrinking for a period of several decades between the doubling of that transistor capacity per $1,000.
Yeah, of course, but and Moore's law is, of course, just one bit of technology, and there are many other areas of technology that don't go so quickly.
Absolutely, the ones that Ray Kurzweil usually gives as an example are the hard drive capacity, which seems to be accelerating, and or memory. RAM memory and things like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, RAM memory, I mean, now that's going to be subject to the same physical limits as CPUs, given we've all now got flash memory, we've thrown away our hard drives. But I could allow me to argue against myself, actually.
Sure, of course. Thank you, too.
I mean, the argument, the really strong argument for this is that, technology should allow you to make technology go faster. And so, look, I'm 55. I started my PhD in 1983 or 1984, and at the time, I mean, the first computer I used in my research, I had to, you had to program by flicking the switches on the front panel. And then I remember the great excitement of getting the first PC clones, and then the nightmare of trying to work out how we, to do our data analysis in, 640K of memory. So, I see my students doing their research with, computing power that's just fantastically much more powerful than anything I had. So, you could say, well, why isn't science going faster? Likewise, I remember if I was trying to read the literature, I'd have to go down to the scientific periodicals library and I'd be up on a ladder pulling journals off and looking through indices. Now I can sit here, everything's on the web. I can use Google Scholar or Web of Science, and I can pull down papers from, all over the place. So it is a puzzle. Productivity, somehow you might have thought that the productivity of science has got faster. But on the other hand, the other side of the coin is, of course, we did the easy stuff already. And so science gets harder because we're trying to solve harder problems and we have better tools. And it does seem to be a bit of a race in which it's not obvious to me that the technology is kind of allowing us to keep up with the difficulty of the problems that we have to solve. So, it wasn't a dumb thing to say that technology should accelerate the growth of further technology. And maybe, it's a reading of the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution that to some extent that happened at that time when you had the combination of printing and journals being circulated and new technology for experiments. But it just doesn't seem to be happening.
Another good sort of argument that I have encountered so far for that was given to me by Carl Schroeder, who is a very good futurist and science fiction writer. And he said, basically, if you have a very complicated system and one or two or even three elements of it exhibit exponential growth trends, that does not necessarily translate to the system as a whole, right? Because there are other parts of the system where sort of the pipeline is much more narrow and it doesn't move along exponential or accelerating trends. And therefore, the system as a whole, and even if particular elements of it may be moving at an accelerating pace in exponential growth, that doesn't necessarily translate to the whole of the system.
I think that's absolutely true. And, if I go on to what the, what's the blockage, what's the rate limiting step in science, I actually think it's, it's human creativity, human smarts.
I was going to say the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's still the case.
We are the weaker link in the system.
We are indeed.
Even though we have improved somewhat marginally, and that brings me to another point that Ramez Naam, who was working on the Bing search engine for some time on Microsoft, on its quote artificial intelligence, and he told me, Bing's AI is amazing, but it's nothing like human AI. First of all, and second of all, he said, I wrote 4 or 5 books, and let me tell you, it doesn't get any easier for the last 5 or 10 years. Every time I write a book, it takes pretty much the same time and the same effort, maybe a tiny little marginally easier because I don't have, as you say, to go down in the basement and look at everything like with a flashlight or something, and I can find it on my desktop, but still the effort of the writing is the same.
Indeed, yeah. And the effort of thinking of something truly original, that gets more difficult.
Absolutely. That's the real tough part. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, let me touch on another kind of marginal point that I want to make about your book, and that's the fact that it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you're kind of using the terms transhumanists and singularitarians almost as synonyms.
Yes, I think I'm. Well, yes, I think that I'm aware that you could draw a distinction, but in this case, yes, I think. In a sense, there's a different emphasis, isn't there? The singularity as being this technological event horizon on the one hand, transhumanism as being about this sense of transcending the limits of human nature on the other. Yes, those are different things, but they often come very closely coupled, I think.
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap, but I would also say there's a lot of there's considerable amount of differences, and it's not necessarily the case that all singularitarians are transhumanists or that all transhumanists are singularitarians. So it's a minor point. Okay, so now let's jump in sort of the meat of the matter here with the core of your argument. So you divide your argument against transhumanism into 2 main parts. The first part is the sort of cultural historical argument, And the second part is the technical argument. So can you please walk us through sort of those arguments one by one? So let's start with the sort of what you call the strange ideological roots of transhumanism.
Yeah. So I guess, the argument of this really, I mean, it's, if we look back at where transhumanism came from, transhumanism, it's not, in some sense, a very modern. It's not a very modern phenomenon, and I think I try to situate it in a very long tradition in Western religious thought of the apocalypse, of the time at which there's a great revealing, a time at which there's a transcendence. And this is, it's familiar in various Western religious traditions, both Christian and Jewish, and I suspect also Islamic too, but I don't know that tradition very well. And it's been a mainstream. It's not quite mainstream. It's been a slight minority sense of those religious traditions for at least a millennium. The idea that we're coming up to some great apocalypse where everything will be different, and the key point being that apocalypse is something that happens in historical time and in historical space.
And in our lifetimes.
I think, as I say, I don't think it's quite orthodoxy in the sense that, for example, in Orthodox Catholic tradition, I believe, and again, I'm not a theologian, but my understanding of that is, in the works of Saint Augustine, we think of the great revelatory books of the Bible, like, Daniel and the Revelation, as being, essentially metaphorical, that they're essentially allegorical, and they talk about, people's own internal spiritual journeys. But, going back, some of the figures I mentioned, Joachim in the 13th century, there's been this tradition of interpreting the Revelation and Daniel and those books as being, predictions of what's going to happen in the future. There's going to be this great revealing. Everything will be different. We'll have, ages of the saints, people living in this transformed new world on earth. And it's not, this is not an original argument to me at all. There's a very strong argument, for example, that Marxism represents, if you like, a kind of secularization of that religious myth that when the state has withered away, we'll be in this kind of transcendent paradise. So it's kind of interesting that if you now to connect it to things that transhumanists would recognize as being, recognizably transhumanist in their character, or indeed singularitarians would recognize as recognizably as singularity, the point where they meet is in that fantastic book by Bernal, the Word, the Flesh, and the Devil. Sorry, now I've forgotten what it's called.
The World, the Flesh, and the Devil.
The World, the Flesh, and the Devil. It's not the Word, the Flesh, and the Devil. It's the World, the Flesh, and the Devil, which is a fantastic essay. I don't know if you've read it. It's really worth looking up.
No, but I'm going to.
Bernal, I think Bernal was a great scientist, and he was a very interesting man. He was a thorough Marxist, and I think this came from this kind of combination of three things: that sense of strong scientific progress that he had, that he had as a scientist in the 20s and 30s. Bernal, his area, he was an X-ray. He did X-ray diffraction. He was one of the first people to start to do X-ray diffraction on biological macromolecules. So you had the sense these are the first people getting in to understand the secrets of biological systems, the secrets of life. So they had that kind of tremendous sense of scientific progress. He had that sense of Marxist progress because he was a Marxist, and living in those, in that slightly cocooned environment.
And most typically, he had the Marxist idea of inevitability, of historical inevitability.
Precisely.
And just to give a little more specificity of what you're talking about, let me quote from page 10, where you say, and that's a quote from Bernal, who says, quote, "Men will not be content to manufacture life. They will want to improve on it," end of quote.
Exactly. And, you know, I quote also as that quote from Trotsky, which echoes that entirely. So, yeah, so you see, so you know, the sense of inevitability came from Marx. It ended up mixed up with science. It had that, you know, Marx got it from Hegel. Hegel got it from who knows where, going back to Jürgen. So that's one strand, and it's fascinating. And then, you know, we have this even odder strand, if you like, that comes through the cosmists and through Fyodorov and going to Tsiolkovsky. And that, of course, interestingly, you know, if we look where Drexler came from, Drexler came out of that movement of thinking about space colonies, thinking about, you know, going into outer space, that came from, you know, all the enthusiasm about space travel that was happening in the, well, you know, from the 40s through to the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And of course, at that time, you know, who couldn't have lived through the 60s and seen those dreams of space travel come true? I mean, as I say, it's, you know, I'm 55. One of my, you know, I got woken up in the middle of the night to go and see Neil Armstrong land on the moon. So, you know, in a sense, that sense of progress, inevitable progress, and that sense of man's destiny in the stars, all that sort of thing, that was very powerful, very powerful set of ideas that were feeding into this.
Yeah, I agree entirely with those, I have to say. And it's hard, perhaps even impossible, to argue against the influence of sort of teleology in general, but in particular Russian cosmism and sort of Marxist sort of scientism on sort of the ideas that later on had major influence on transhumanism. So I agree with you very much on that. But why do you think that's important to understand?
I think it's important to understand that your ideas don't come from nowhere, and that they have a long history, and you need to think about them critically. And so, you know, I was having a conversation a few weeks ago with another interviewer who was, you know, he was making this point. He was saying, you know, just because some idea comes from a religious background, you know, it doesn't make it wrong. You know, that, as I say, I kind of enjoy the irony, because I've engaged with some transhumanists who are very aggressively atheist, very aggressively secular, and you know, it's a reliable way of winding them up, if you like, to kind of point this out. But, you know, it's a fair point. And as I say, you know, I think, you know, far from not everything that Marx wrote was wrong either. But you need to understand where these ideas come from. You need to understand why people have been so keen to believe them. And you need to just poke yourself and ask yourself, you know, am I being critical enough about what I'm thinking, or am I just slipping into a pattern of thought that I've inherited from people in centuries past that is motivated by other things apart from, you know, honest analysis?
Yeah, I agree with that very much, actually. And let me just say here, you finished that chapter on page 12 by saying that the idea that history is destiny has proved to be an extremely bad one, and I don't think the idea that technology is destiny will necessarily work out that well either.
Yep.
Of course, I totally agree with and embrace that, and which is why my blog is not about technology, but it's about ethics.
Indeed.
It's a choice, right? It's what we choose to do that ends up making the difference. There's no teleological destiny that we are unfolding towards blindly or unwillingly, if you will. But it's basically the future is created in the moment of decision, in the moment that we make our choices. And that's why I believe ethics is so vitally important, because this is how we forge the future.
Indeed.
This is why I also tend to agree with you more and tend to disagree with Ray about the predictability necessarily, especially in the longer term of, let's say, 15, 20 or 30 years.
Yeah.
So let's move now a little bit more into sort of the depth of the technical details of the technical argument that you have against transhumanism, and that's like where your area of expertise lies, perhaps most deeply and profoundly, and that's divided into three parts. So the first part is perhaps sort of the importance and relevance of nanotechnology as epitomized by the work of Eric Drexler.
Yeah.
The second one is sort of the idea of indefinite life extension or immortality as epitomized by the work of Aubrey de Grey. And lastly, perhaps the ideas of artificial intelligence, and perhaps one of the ways of accomplishing that would be potentially mind uploading and so on.
Absolutely, yeah.
Let's take those one by one here. Let's start with nanotechnology. What's kind of the vision of nanotechnology that fits within transhumanism, and why is it technologically flawed or implausible or inaccurate?
Well, this really is where I started in this business, and I should say I started. I read the works of Eric Drexler. I thought, well, this is all really exciting, and actually had some resonance with what I was trying to do in my own, in a very small way, perhaps in my own laboratory. And I suppose the way I would characterize the argument that Drexler made, and I think Drexler was more original sometimes than even he gives himself credit for, because I think Drexler spent a lot of time. I mean, people, for example, talk about Feynman as the founder of nanotechnology. Actually, Drexler made a very original contribution to it, which was to point out this analogy with biology, and to point out, if we're talking about making little machines that operate on the nanoscale, that can convert energy and that can build things with atomic precision, biology offers that existence proof. So, so if we look at a cell biology, you look at things like ribosomes. They're fantastic machines that work with great accuracy and can do marvelous things. And we see. We have to occasionally, things are very familiar to us, and we have to pinch ourselves to remind us how incredible they are. But the idea that an animal goes around munching the grass or whatever and converting the grass into this very complicated structure that is that animal. That's an incredible transformation, and it happens through these nanoscale machines that biology has.
So far so good. Then, so what's the problem? What's the issue with Drexler vision then?
So here's the issue. So Drexler pointed that out, and that was a really important insight. What he then did, and what where people have run with the idea, has been to say, well, if biology does it in ways that seem a bit difficult for us to understand. Biology uses soft, floppy materials. It uses these random design processes. It all looks a bit kind of haphazard and not very well engineered. So surely if we were to rethink it, sit down and re-engineer nanotechnology, re-engineer biology, we'd make something better. And so Drexler's book, Nanosystems, is, if you like, a systematic attempt to reimagine what a nanotechnology would look like.
To propose a way to accomplish that vision.
Absolutely. If you were to use the principles of mechanical engineering, as he said, he says nanosystems, it's the principles of mechanical engineering applied to chemistry. Now, my argument is that this misses a point. It misses a really important point, and that's that the principles of mechanical engineering work well in our everyday macroscale world, because the kind of physics that we encounter is the right physics, if you like, for mechanical engineering to solve the problems of that physics. The physics that you encounter in the nanoscale world looks very different. It looks, I'm specifically talking about the physics that biology works in. It's wet, it's warm, you've got Brownian motion, you've got the constant jiggling around. It's a very different set of problems that cell biology has to solve. And actually the methods that cell biology uses to solve that, although they look slightly weird to us, are actually pretty much optimized for that world. So the argument that biology shows that you can do it, but we could do it much better by re-engineering it according to engineering principles, I think falls because it doesn't recognize the way that the physics looks different at the nanoscale and that the biology actually uses operating principles that are pretty well optimized for those conditions.
So Richard, I'm not a nanotechnology expert myself, of course, as you know. I'm more of a sort of a simple philosopher guy, if you will. Let's accept that what you say about Eric Drexler's argument and its technical feasibility is 100% accurate, right? So Eric Drexler's proposed way through mechanical engineering of accomplishing that vision is not going to work. Does that make it, though, in principle, implausible that there may be an alternative route or alternative routes to get there? Is that absolutely impossible, or is just one way that's a bad way?
Well, it depends where there is. I think,
Well, there, as you put it, and I think that maybe that was a quote from Drexler, there is the moment where the material world becomes software.
Exactly. That's a very compelling vision. I don't think we can get there in any universal way, that in the way that Drexler imagines and is kind of, talked about in various science fiction books.
So I accept that Drexler's way, as I said, may be faulty, but does that make it absolutely infeasible in any other alternative way?
Well, as I say, I think the grand universal vision of completely reducing the material world to software, I cannot see how you can do it. Does that mean that they're not interesting things to do by trying to see what biology does and trying to use those principles, making nanoscale machines and devices? Absolutely, I think that's a fascinating project. And, in my own lab, we've been trying to do it in our own kind of rather crude way. And incidentally, if you, just a year or two ago, I last had a conversation with Eric, and, in terms of what we would say, what the research priorities are for right now, actually, we'd probably be pretty close in agreement. We look at DNA nanotechnology, the kind of stuff that Ned Seaman pioneered, where you can make fantastic nanoscale structures by self-assembly. I think it's beautiful science, absolutely the right thing to do. It's just where we disagree, I think, is where it'll lead. And I suppose I'm just much more skeptical that it will lead to the grand universalizing vision of all matter being software. I think it will lead to interesting, useful technologies that we ought to develop that will be, that will could have big applications in medicine and such like. Not very quickly, I might say, but the universalizing vision, I can't see how it's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Let me tell you how this sounds to me, like to the layperson like me, who is kind of interested and engaged in this matter. So I'm willing to buy your argument that perhaps Eric Drexler's pathway is flawed. I fail, though, to accept the possibility that the vision is an impossibility quite yet. So, and sort of like, it reminds me, your argument on the sort of the grander scheme reminds me a little bit to something which Peter Diamandis sometimes says, which is an expert is someone who can tell you something that you cannot do, or what's impossible to do. And it reminds me to Lord Kelvin, who, by the way, was also a physicist and a mathematician. In the late 1890s, I think, he wrote a book on why heavier than air aircraft is impossible to design or construct or engineer. And of course, then we had two bicycle makers who never read his book, who kind of proved him wrong.
It's very easy to find experts who've made mistakes, and that's why I spend quite a lot of time desperately trying not to be definitive about what I say and say, I can't see how to do it. And, I'm kind of maybe my British empirical upbringing makes me resistant to grand visions, and so I think about what's going to happen in the next 50 or 100 years, and maybe I reserve judgment of what's going to happen after then. But I say it like I say it. I think,
Sure, and you may be correct, absolutely. Actually, I'm just saying that I'm not convinced that it's impossible.
Yeah, impossible is a very difficult word.
Okay, so let's move on to the next part of the argument then. I'm kind of thinking here if I should actually take an interesting sideline, because I've already mentioned two physicists and I want to mention a bunch of others and see if we can have a laugh about that. But, my previous interview last week was with another physicist whose name was Jan Tallinn, who is the founder of Skype. And he said he's part of the group of physicists who want to save the world.
Yeah.
And a very notable few names among those are Max Tegmark, Nick Bostrom, of course, who is also a transhumanist.
Well, he's a philosopher, I think, isn't he, rather than a physicist?
Well, by education, he's a physicist.
Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
His education is in physics, actually. And, of course, Martin Rees, who is actually a colleague there of yours in Cambridge.
Yes, I've met him a few times, indeed.
Right. So I don't know, it's an interesting kind of observation, as I said in the beginning, how many physicists there are on both sides of the transhumanist argument, and what do you want to say about that? Because I think they're overrepresented as opposed to other scientists. Is that not funny and interesting?
Well, it is interesting. Physicists, we have slight imperial tendencies, as you know. So we do tend to think that, there's no part of human knowledge that we shouldn't have a view on. So I think that I think there's a very good tradition in physics of not feeling too restricted to one's field and trying to think more broadly. And I did my training in the Cavendish Laboratory, which kind of prides itself on having revolutionized biology by from discovering the structure of DNA. So I think it's an interesting sideline. Physicists are do have a tradition of thinking broadly. I think the notion that one wants to save the world is an important one too. I mean, I'd love to save the world too. I'm not sure I quite know how to do it, but I'm passionately keen to understand. To think about what we do about things like sustainable energy, low carbon energy. In terms of the other things I try and do. That's something that I care very deeply about.
I agree entirely with you on sustainable energy, and I hope that people like you can create sort of the nanotechnology sort of improvements for the tools like photovoltaic, solar batteries, or anything else that can be used to take us into that epoch.
No, absolutely, and that's again in my day job. That's one of the areas that I've been doing a fair amount of work on is understanding the nanoscale structure of these new organic photovoltaics, which hopefully are cheaper and can be produced in much bigger quantities. So yeah, I think those are areas that absolutely we need to promote more research, more development. Getting things out at scale in big quantities.
But it's funny observation to me as a layperson as to how some transhumanists like you are, or some physicists like you are anti-transhumanists, and others are transhumanists.
Yeah, well, all human life is there, isn't
it? But they're very visible, and also let me use that as a segue to get back on topic here and address the third part of your technical argument, which pertains to artificial intelligence. And two other very well-known, straightforward physicists, Max Tegmark and, of course, we should not forget to mention Dr. Stephen Hawking, have brought a lot of public attention and media attention lately on the issues related to artificial intelligence and the potential dangers posed by it.
Yeah.
First of all, what do you want to say about that at the general level? And then I would let you have time to go deeper at the technical level and how it pertains to our argument today.
Right. Well, I'd want to distinguish between, artificial intelligence in the general sense and, people, names come in and out of fashion, don't they? People, there's a lot of talk now about machine learning. and I think maybe that's a better term to have. It's clear the combination of big databases, smart programming, lots of processing power is allowing us to create artificial systems that can systematically sift through huge quantities of data, extract patterns, use those patterns to kind of influence action. So self-driving cars is a good example. So those are technological changes that are important and powerful and can have both positive and negative effects. And to the extent that one only has to look at I think robotics is a subject that's in a absolutely fascinating phase at the moment, and in some sense quite a frightening one. And so we're already seeing drones being used in combat with the technical possibilities for increased autonomous action of those drones. This is not a remote possibility. This is pretty much happening now. So in that sense, machine learning, robotics, artificial intelligence in that sense is it's a clear and present danger. However, I don't think that's at all the same as the question of creating human or human-like intelligences on synthetic substrates, which I think is the subject of my chapter on brain uploading. So that's a very, what I've got there is a very specific question, which is, can you emulate a human intelligence, human consciousness, if you like? If we make the assumption that if you reproduced, if you introduced the computing power of a brain, the consciousness would magically emerge. Actually, I'm kind of neutral on that. I think it might well do. But that technical question, and again, I suppose you could legitimately say, or you're never saying it. Well, I have a very tentative argument about why it might be impossible, but the thrust of my argument is, it's really difficult. It's just much, much more difficult than people think, and it's not going to happen anytime soon. And that's really based on thinking a little bit about the nature of information processing in biological systems. And I think the point, if I was going to summarize that point briefly, it is that people underestimate how much information processing there is in biological systems. And in particular, the one thing that they do is they make a wrong mapping, if you like, from the biological to the computer. The mapping at the level of the neuron, the neuron, or possibly the synapse to the transistor. It's the wrong mapping. The unit of biological computing is the molecule. And, if there's one slogan, I would say that would be it. And when you realize that, then suddenly you realize, gosh, this problem is just much, much more difficult than anyone, than people currently think.
If I'm to nail the thing that I most enjoy, and to me personally was the most enlightening in your whole book, is exactly this one sentence that you just said, that molecules are the most fundamental unit of biological information processing, and it's not the neurons, right? For me, that's the thing that I will take and carry with me the most from your book, and that's kind of the most kind of illuminating and enlightening part of it, if you will, personally. So tell us a bit more about that.
Well, and then I should say, it's not an original observation by me. I mean, the person whose observation that is Dennis Bray, who's a Cambridge scientist. He wrote a really good book called Wetware, which I really strongly recommend. And I mean, perhaps the way to think about this is to think yourself into the mind of a bacteria. We think of bacteria as being the simplest thing, the simplest organism there is. But a bacteria is already doing huge amounts of information processing. And the way it's doing that is through, chemical stimuli. The classic thing that people have studied and do understand in detail is, how does a bacteria know to swim towards food? Well, it's a sensor. It's a molecule that combines chemical inputs and produces a chemical input output, and that chemical output itself is a signal that tells the bacteria to change the mode of its swimming. So even at these tight, simple, crudest of organisms, they're already doing purposeful behavior, if you like. Now, when we build ourselves up, build up to the kind of information processing that we're doing in a brain, each one of our cells is doing all that all the time. Then our nerve cells are doing that kind of chemical processing, and in addition, they've got this trick with electrical potentials, which, by the way, also fundamentally depends on macromolecular shape change. It depends on molecules changing shape in response to signals coming in. That's the way that biological information processing works. So, when you do a classic experiment on a nerve cell, you see an electrical pulse go down it. That itself is already a collective phenomenon that results from lots and lots of individual molecular actions. So, you're integrating up all the time molecules processing information, creating signals, creating larger scale phenomena like the action potential, like releasing molecules across synapses, and it's all building up to something much more complex. And it makes it, we didn't design it. The other thing is we didn't design it. It all emerged from this amazing process of evolution. So, the principles that we imagine, that the principles that we rely on, if you think about how to understand a CPU, those principles we can't rely on. The distinction between hardware and software, the idea that we've got a discrete layer in which you can think about logic, you don't have to worry about what's going on in smaller details. All those kind of separation of length scales, the separation of processes, it's not there. It's just a ghastly, hideous mixture that's enormously complex, and that's why it's so rich. But it's also why it's going to be such a difficult thing to simulate.
Mm-hmm. Tell me a little more about sort of the random quantum effects and technological determinism.
Well, this is now getting to where I'm starting to speculate. The one thing I'd say is, thinking about how you do a simulation. If you look at a biological macromolecule, we can do many experiments on biological macromolecules. They're always moving. They're moving randomly. They're flexing. They're moving around, and that random motion, that's what their operation depends on. Okay, so when I say random, what do I mean by random? Well, if I'm doing a simulation, I would be putting in randomness through using, calls to a pseudo-random number generator. And it's a very interesting thing when we talk about randomness, isn't it? What do we mean by something being random? Is it truly random in that there's no way of predicting what could happen next? Or does it just seem random because we're not able to follow all the little details that are going on? And this gets, it's a very fundamental issue in statistical mechanics. And, there are actually different opinions. Now, my view about it is that the randomness is genuine randomness because it comes from quantum mechanics. Now, at this point, I know, there's an interesting discussion about, is quantum mechanics important in biology? Is it important in in the brain operation? And what people usually mean by that is, are the mysterious coherent effects of quantum mechanics important? And my answer to that is probably not, because the nature of the environment, the coherence length is very short. But there's a phenomenon in biology, or a phenomenon in nanoscale physics, that's very important. And it's a phenomenon called van der Waals forces. It's actually very familiar. You learn about it at high school or certainly in university. And it's what makes biological macromolecules stick together. It's one of the fundamental forces that's always operating. Now, when you scratch the surface of this and ask, where does the van der Waals force come from? The best way of thinking about it is that it comes from actually the vacuum fluctuations, the fluctuations that take place in a vacuum in quantum mechanics, the idea that photons and antiphotons are constantly popping out and going back in again. So it's to be technical about it, the force arises because two solid bodies change the nature of the electric field between them, and they change the spectrum of random fluctuations, and that leads to a force. It's a force that arises because of randomness, because of quantum mechanical randomness, and because of that, the force itself is random. So Van der Waals force is attractive, but if you imagine that the attraction will be modulated by little jiggles that come from that quantum mechanical randomness. So I think fundamentally, the physics that makes your brain works has got randomness baked into it at a very deep level from quantum mechanics. And so from that point of view, it's not deterministic. The information processing that goes on in our brains and our bodies is not deterministic at a really fundamental and deep level.
Mm-hmm. And just to highlight what you just say with two quotes from your book, on page 35 you say, quote, "The molecular basis of biological computation means that it isn't deterministic. It's stochastic. It's random. The randomness isn't an accidental add-on. It's intrinsic to the way molecular formulation processing works." And a little further on, you say, "It seems to me that all the agonizing about whether the idea of free will is compatible with a brain that operates through deterministic physics is completely misplaced, because the brain just doesn't operate through deterministic physics."
Yeah, we can just stop worrying about it.
Absolutely. Okay, so, absolutely. we have about 15 minutes, so I think we just have to move on through your argument as we go to be able to finish on time. So the last little bit here is about sort of the pursuit of sort of indefinite life extension. And I think that's kind of the most obviously proto-religious kind of part of the field, which is the hardest to debate against, in my view anyway. So tell me a little bit about that.
Well, again, and here I am. I'm trying not to say impossible, but I guess what I'm saying here is, I think there are some problems in human medicine which currently are very hard, and I think there's a view around, and I guess Aubrey de Grey is the one who's most associated with it, is that the reason that we haven't solved the problem, the diseases of aging, is simply because we haven't tried hard enough, or we haven't used a hard-nosed engineering approach enough. And I just think that this is this is just not realistic. I think there are some enormously serious diseases of aging, and the various dementias are the ones that really leap to mind. We're making lots of progress with cancer, but cancer is still fairly intractable. We have lots of lifestyle-related diseases, of course, which tells us that we should worry as much about social, society and politics as medicine, because plenty of people die completely unnecessarily due to just the social conditions. So that it's perhaps speaks to something about wrong priorities that we don't address that first. But then, we're left with these really intractable sets of conditions around dementia, Alzheimer's in particular, Parkinson's disease, which are really hard diseases to understand. Well, they're hard diseases to cure because we don't actually understand where they come from. And, again, you could say to me, am I saying that, in 50 years or 100 years we won't have a cure for Alzheimer's? My answer is, I absolutely hope we do. We ought to be spending more effort trying to work out how we do that. But I think at this moment in time, to say that, we're on the verge of infinite life extension it's unrealistic and somehow slightly delusional, and I think it kind of takes away from the seriousness of the challenges that we face. And I say seriousness that's both social and biomedical.
So don't you think that, for example, some recent breakthroughs in telomere lengthening techniques and their impact, for example, on mice or lab mice, where we've been able to increase life expectancy in old mice, mind you, by something like 230%, and even restore vigor and brain size and performance in mice. And that was maybe 3 or 4 years ago now. Don't you think those sound or look like sort of precursors that we are getting closer?
Well, no, progress is always welcome, isn't it? But it's as we were saying before, when you were talking about, exponential technologies, there's a weakest link somewhere. If you fix one disease, then you die of another. At the moment, I think the weakest link are the dementias. And, we're really not finding it very easy to get much of a handle on them. So, the telomere story is an interesting one. There are other things that we're doing with, in other areas. I mean, I was at a technical conference earlier this week and talking about regenerative medicine and, the kind of technical advances that we're able to do, with scaffolds, persuading stem cells to differentiate in the right way. What would we need to do to be able to regenerate damaged heart tissues? All along this one, I don't want you ever to think that either I'm against technological progress or even think it's not happening. I do. I just think that we need to be very realistic about the scale of the challenges and the fact that, particularly, the aging one is a particularly difficult one because there's all... you get into old age and pretty much everything fails. That's the problem. It's not just you can't just fix up one system, you've got to fix up all of them.
Yeah, but the idea here is that if we prevent the aging process itself, then you would kind of resolve more, if not all, but many of those issues and illnesses related or associated with old age.
Well, no, but you're already making a question to say there is an aging process. I don't think there is an aging process. I think there's quite a lot of aging processes. The process that leads to the kind of, protein misfolding, the kind of, protein aggregation that we believe is underneath some of the dementias. That's a completely different process to the removing of the capacity for cells to repair themselves that underlies the telomere story. So there are lots of different stories, lots of different aging processes, and you have to get all of them right. As I say, don't get me wrong, I absolutely think that we ought to be spending a lot of time trying to work out how to solve all these problems. I just think it's delusional to think it's going to happen anytime soon. And again, going back to progress and Moore's law and things, we have to face the fact that actually, in some areas of biomedical science, progress is slowing down. The money it's now taking to bring a drug to market, it's gone through a few decades where it's costing us exponential more money and resource to get a working treatment into the body. So it's we need to kind of walk a middle line here. I don't want to say, we're all doomed and there's no point trying. But on the other hand, I suppose, why I think the technological determinism argument, if there is a sense that technological determinism is seeping out into the public, people think, oh, technology is accelerating, it's all going to be fine, everything's marvelous. This stuff doesn't happen unless we put serious effort and resources into it. And I suppose that's what we need to do.
Yeah, and I agree with that we require focused effort and resources. And that's why I thought in the beginning was so important for me to sort of distinguish and differentiate that, in my view, most transhumanists do not find themselves on the side of determinism and on the side of passivity, but rather call for more focused effort and resources and stuff like that. But Richard, time is advancing here. So let me just say, perhaps, that if you're curious, that perhaps I agree with you on the sort of mind uploading stream of your argument, part of your argument. And I agree, even though I've interviewed people like Professor Randall Koenig, who said mind uploading is no longer science fiction in his view. But I've interviewed many other people too, and in my opinion, we're very, very, very far away from it. And you make, to me, the strongest argument there on that realm. On the life extension part, I think we've made a lot more progress, and I think it's possible to see better results much further ahead. Maybe not in the next 10 or 20 years, but maybe in the next 30 years or 40 years. So I'm personally a lot more optimistic there, though I can't say or guarantee or promise any of that will happen indeed. Because again, I'm not a determinist, and I'm not a believer that it's inevitable in any way, shape, or form. But let's presume that everything that you've said in your book is 100% correct for the sake of the argument. So the cultural, sort of historical reasons and connections to religions, the sort of the technical reasons, be it from life extension, be it from nanotechnology, be it from mind uploading / artificial intelligence, are all correct. Why should we care then about transhumanism if it's totally wrong and flawed?
Well, I think that this, I think you earlier in the interview you said something that I agreed with, which I think is at the heart of it, which is that this is all about the choices that we make. I think the most important point I would want to get across is that progress isn't guaranteed. We need to ask ourselves what we mean by progress too. We need to, that term itself contains lots of freight in terms of, progress for who benefits, who doesn't benefit. So, we need, as a society, we have to make those choices about, what's the progress that we want and what's the progress that we don't want. We have to work out, what's doable. We have to be a bit hard-nosed about what the scale of the challenges that we face are. So I think, maybe you think I'm being unfair, but my charge is that transhumanism, as it's perceived in the popular world, I think is damaging to the way that we talk about technology. It's damaging to the way that we think about technology. And I think we could have a much more open discussion about technology if we're able to leave some of those ideas behind and, as I say, think about the future in a more open way. Think about it not as something that we're heading towards that's going to arrive in 2042, but something that, we don't know what the future's going to be. The future could be very much worse than we'd like. We hope the future will be much better. I've got children. I want them to grow up into a world that's better than the one that I grew up in. I don't think that's guaranteed. So I think we need a much more considered discussion about what kind of progress do we want, what sort of technology do we want, what do we need to get that technology. Because again, to bring it back to the economic argument of right now, is that our economies aren't growing. We've had a long period. Well, we've had a period since 1945, 1950, depending on where you are, of very fast growth driven by technological change. That seems to be sputtering, and actually in the here and now, the politics of that are starting to get a bit ugly, as I think we see in many countries in the developed world. So it's about how we think about technology, what the most productive way of thinking about technology is, how we make the right choices in the progress that we want and the technologies that we want to develop.
Richard, and that's kind of the whole purpose of my existence and my work for the last 5 or 6 years, because I'm trying to sort of create the context where we have precisely that kind of discourse that you're talking about and ask exactly those questions, because I believe that those would be ethical choices that we make, and politics will play. I'm a reforming political scientist, so and ethics is, at least in theory, the best place where you should apply, politics is, at least in theory, where you should apply ethics the most at best. So I agree entirely with you on that sense. I think we can agree to disagree on the fact as to whether transhumanism actually supports that goal or damages it. And I'm more on the side that I think transhumanism promotes that kind of discourse and that kind of goal and the pursuit of that through scientific means. Despite its many flaws and idiosyncrasies and people and even religious connotations, if you will. But let me ask you here, what's the best place for anyone of my audience to kind of follow your work and find more about what you do?
So I have a blog of my own. It's called Soft Machines. It's after my book. So if you look on my blog, so that's www.softmachines.org, you find a lot of writing there. Some of it's getting quite, it varies between being science and economics, and there's some stuff that's maybe of less interest because it's quite hardcore science policy. But that's it. Pretty much everything I've written is linked to from that blog. So that's the one-stop shop for stuff that I've written and thought about over the years.
Mm-hmm. Richard, you already preempted my classic last question, which is the most important thing that our audience should take away from this conversation with you. But I'd like to give you again the last word, as I always do, maybe to add or elaborate on that. How do we close our conversation? What do you want to say as our last word?
Well, I'd like to agree with you about the importance of ethics, the importance of politics. I think talking about technology is really important. I think we've had a great discussion about technology now. Thanks so much for the opportunity to do that.
If you guys enjoy this show, you can help me make it better in a couple of ways. You can go and write a review on iTunes, or you can simply make a donation.